that we need for our EEZ, and this bill will do the job. Thank you.
I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki. Tēnā koe.
Mr. Speaker.
Maioi.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start by saying I don't think you'd get any disagreement in this House that legislation monitoring and governing what happens in our exclusive economic zone and continental shelf is needed. What we on this side of the House are saying is that this bill simply doesn't achieve the government's stated aims of allowing that economic activity to continue whilst protecting the environment in which it occurs. Now, New Zealand has the 5th largest exclusive economic zone and continental shelf in the world, and the only reason that we have any right to, for example, exploit resources in that area is because we are signatories to the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. But in signing that convention, we also signed up to an obligation to put in place legislation that would allow any activity in that area to occur in an environmentally sustainable way. And I have to put on record our concern and disappointment that the government has decided to charge ahead with the exploitation of mineral resources in our exclusive economic zone before this bill has even passed through the House. I think it shows a level of arrogance and shows how actually the debating process in this House, the committee stage that's coming up, the Select Committee was just a rubber stamping exercise because they're so sure that it's just going to get rubber stamped by the parties that are supporting it, which at the first reading was more parties, and we're very happy now that the Select Committee process has highlighted the inadequacies of this piece of legislation. But now it's going to be rubber stamped by ACT, rubber stamped by the United Future, rubber stamped by National, and in fact we're not going to have the proper debate that we need to have. And all the while the government's going out there and saying, please come in here, go into the exclusive economic zone, exploit those resources. We've got a voluntary regime in place. And on the first reading of this bill, I put to the then Minister Nick Smith the case on the East Coast with Petrobras coming in and carrying out oil and gas exploration. And he said to me, no, we guarantee that nothing can ever happen until the bill's passed. Well, that's actually not true. There's a voluntary regime in place that they're asking people to prescribe to. But if this bill doesn't meet our international obligations under UNCLOS, then certainly a voluntary regime does not meet our international obligations. And we think that perhaps the government should just have waited until we had legislation in place before allowing those activities to go ahead. Now, the issue has been raised about whether or not this meets our international obligation, and clearly there's disagreement. It is not true that we were told by all submitters that it did meet our international obligation. We were astonished that the government hadn't even bothered to get a legal opinion on this before it got to Select Committee. And the reality is we're never going to know until it's tested in the courts. That's the reality. But we could have made certain that it would have met our international obligations by simply using the language that the Convention uses. Because what the Convention says is it's not a balance between economic development and environmental protection. We have a right to exploit the resources in our exclusive economic zone, but that comes with an obligation, a duty, to ensure environmental protection. That's not a trade-off. That's a right with an obligation. Environmental protection is the bottom line. As the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment said in her submission, and I want to quote it, she said, quote, "We can pursue economic development, but we must protect the environment. The former, economic development, is optional. The latter, environmental protection, is not," unquote. And that's what the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment told the committee. Well, Minister Joyce can make fun of it. It'll be great when we're in court, the government's in court defending this weak piece of legislation just because he wouldn't put in a simple purpose clause which showed that we were consistent with UNCLOS and left absolutely no question as to whether or not we'd met our international obligations. Mr. Speaker, I now want to come to the issue of the regs, because one of the other issues that was raised at committee was the fact that so much of this is being done in regulation, and this is a pattern we're seeing with this national government, particularly on contentious pieces of legislation. Put as much of it as possible into regulation as you can, then it doesn't see the light of day at a select committee, it doesn't come to the House to be debated. And these, Mr. Speaker, this is the discussion document on the regulations on this particular piece of legislation. Now, as you can see, it's not insubstantial. And what submitters said to us was, it's really difficult for us to know how effective or ineffective this piece of legislation is going to be when we haven't seen the regulations. And the regulations were only released after we'd heard submissions at Select Committee. So they said, could you please send the bill either keep the bill in select committee until we've had time to review the regulations and maybe come back to you with a supplementary submission. Don't have to be heard in person, it could be a written submission. Or send the bill back to committee once the regulations are released, because this is a discussion document, Mr Speaker, but we know how discussion documents go with the National Party. Basically, it's this is what we're going to do. We're going to put it on our website, invite you to waste your time reading it and writing and telling us what you think, despite the fact that you know a lot more about it than we do. Then we're going to ignore everything you say. Sorry, Mr Speaker. Then they'll ignore everything that those submitters say and do exactly what they were going to do in the first place, which is implement this. So submitters know that these are the regs that are going to ultimately be in place, and they would just like the opportunity to go back to the select committee, take account of the regulations alongside the legislation, and advise the committee and this House on what the actual overall impact of the bill is going to be. But obviously they were not given that opportunity, and given how quickly the regulations review, discussion document was released after the bill came back from select committee, I don't think it would have been too difficult to have slowed down that process a little bit to have allowed that to happen. Clearly it was a deliberate attempt to not let that happen. We've also talked a lot about the Resource Management Act, and what National tries to say is they try to make out that Labor says we should just extend the RMA. Well, that's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is that the line that occurs at 12 miles is jurisdictional only. It's only there because within 12 miles, that's our sovereign territory, and on the other side of 12 miles, it's not. That's why the line is there. It's got nothing to do with science, it's got nothing to do with resource allocation, it's got nothing to do with the environment, it's jurisdictional. So why would you have a completely different regime in the exclusive economic zone compared to inshore? And Jackie Dean says it's because we don't have authority in the exclusive economic zone. Our shipping laws occur sovereignty in the exclusive economic zone. Then Jackie Dean, how can our coastal shipping laws occur in the exclusive economic zone? How can our health and safety laws work in the exclusive economic zone? How can our fisheries laws work in the exclusive economic zone? How does the Biosecurity Act manage to operate in the exclusive? Apparently, the only piece of legislation that is completely incapable of working in our exclusive economic zone is the Resource Management Act. So that's why we can't have a bar of it. What a load of garbage. The reason, and one of the energy companies who came and spoke to the committee said to us, we support this because it's going to be far more permissive than the Resource Management Act, and that's the reality. Why would you create brand new legal tests in the exclusive economic zone? Why would you not call on 20 years of RMA case law, and put in place language and legal tests that are well tested, well understood, that councils use now? The Taranaki Regional Council told us at Select Committee we would rather have tests and processes that we already know. It has allowed oil and gas exploration to go ahead in Taranaki under the RMA. It hasn't stopped it. So why would you not use, instead of inventing this new term of favoured doubt? No one knows what that means. This bill is an absolute boom for lawyers, Mr Speaker. That's who's really going to benefit out of this piece of legislation, because these are all untested. Mr Chevelle says so it's not all bad then. It's untested, and there is no reason to have two completely different regimes side by side, one far more permissive than the other, especially when you consider that some of these activities are actually going to cross that barrier, that barrier. So they'll go through an RMA process and a process to get a marine consent in the exclusive economic zone. Both those processes are completely different. One, you can appeal to the Environment Court. The other one you can't. You can only go to the High Court on points of law. It's an absolute mess. And all because the government wants to make it as easy as possible for this activity to go ahead without the environmental protections that the RMA has provided in our territorial waters. That's the reason, to make it more permissive. And yet, arguably, the marine environment that we're talking about is far more dangerous in the exclusive economic zone. It's deeper. The Rokumura Basin, 3,000 to 4,000 metres deep, where Petrobras are doing their exploration. The Gulf of Mexico was 1,400 metres deep. That is far more dangerous, far more risky, and arguably should have legislation which is far more robust when we're deciding to let that activity go ahead. Because let's be clear, the concern with this legislation is around oil and gas exploration. There are a number of other activities, as members point out. And at Select Committee, the Chair kept saying, this isn't about oil. She kept saying to submitters, don't talk about oil. But if the activity does result in an oil spill, then it is about oil. It is about oil, Mr Speaker. So there are a number of things that will traverse through the committee stage. For example, we're concerned about the provisions about penalties and cost recovery. There's actually nothing that realistically in here would require a company to have the money to be able to pay for the entirety of a cost recovery in terms of bonds or insurance. The penalties are incredibly weak. They're not going to be any kind of disincentive, and the processes in the bill are massively stacked against people submitting on an application and in favour of those making the application. As I said before, only being allowed to appeal to the High Court instead of the Environment Court on points of law raises natural justice issues and will actually clog the system up and not make it any easier. Mr Speaker, we would like to work with the government to make this piece of legislation workable, and we obviously want to see legislation in place. This does not do what the government says it's going to do, and it is crucial that we get it right.
I call the honourable member